Okay, good afternoon. My name is Chris McCarty. Some of you may have met me before or seen me do a presentation. If you have, I apologize for having to watch me again. Today's going to be a lot more brief than normal. What we're talking about is just a brief refresher on behavior intervention plans in the classroom. We're going to talk about what they are, why they're important, and what the consequences can be if we don't follow those. And again, we're going to try to do this pretty quickly. If there are follow-up questions, please make sure you ask the Department of Special Education. If there's anything specific, they can definitely get in touch with me. We can follow back up with you and make sure I can clarify it for you. But we don't want anybody walking out of this confused in any way. But thanks again for your time. You can tell I'm great with computers. Okay. So again, obviously, if we're talking about behavior intervention plans, if we're going down to the ground level, what we're really talking about are accommodations for our disabled students. And remember, today we're going to focus on IEPs, but you can have behavior intervention plans now, and you can certainly have functional behavior assessments, which are going to predate a behavior intervention plan. You can have those with a 504 student as well. And what we're seeing, and you're seeing more of these behavior intervention plans, it's not because the local school system is wanting to do that or necessarily that we've changed policy. What's happened is the feds are putting a new renewed focus on them, and so is the state. In fact, now, if we look at, for example, with our manifestations that we have to do, if a student's looking at a long-term placement or possibly suspension or expulsion following some sort of egregious behavior, if we determine as part of that review, if that student has a 504 or has an IEP, that the behavior manifested from the disability, then if we check yes on that box, then we have to do a functional behavior assessment, which more than likely could lead to a behavior plan. So what I'm saying is, in a very fast way, you are going to see more behavior intervention plans. We are going to have to follow more behavior intervention plans in the classroom, and it's mandatory. You're going to hear me say that a lot today, but it's not an optional concept. All right, so again, let's just talk about the law itself. So when we look at where IEPs come from, those come from the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's found at 20 USC 1412. And what does it say? It says basically that a student with disabilities, and with an IEP, that student has disability or disabilities which are affecting their educational or academic progress. That's going to be the difference, right? A 504, you're going to have a student with a disability under federal law, but that might not be really impeding much academic progress or not in a substantial way. So we might have to accommodate them in some ways, but usually not in the same way or to the same degree that we would with a student with an IEP. And again, what we're mandated to provide always is a free, appropriate public education. Now, what's important about that is the word appropriate. I hate to say it this way, it's just the truth. It doesn't say the gold standard. It doesn't say we're going to provide you a perfect education. Such a thing doesn't exist. But we have to provide an appropriate level of public education for all students, including our students with disabilities. All right, so what does that mean? That means with an IEP, the most important word that we look at there is individual, right? It's an individual or individualized education plan. What that law talks about is taking the student specifically, finding out what they need, what they have, what disabilities they have, and tailoring what we're going to do for them from instruction, from accommodations to services to fit that individual child. No IEP should look identical. No behavior intervention plan should look identical. I know that's frustrating because a lot of us, and I was a classroom teacher, a lot of us want to use consistent rules, and we want to have classroom rules, and we want to say this is how it applies to all kids. I'm just going to provide the bad news there. Now, if you have a student in your class that has a behavior intervention plan, and that behavior intervention plan calls for interventions that are different from your classroom rules, calls for interventions that are different from your school rules, I'll take it one further, calls for interventions that are different from school system rules, the behavior intervention plan wins. The IEP wins. Because at the end of the day, an IEP or a 504, what is it? It is a contract that we are mandated to enter into with parents and sometimes kids, if they're over 18, to provide them accommodations and or services for their disabilities. It's a contract. The moment we sign it, the moment the LEA agrees to it, we are bound to follow it. And that is, when I say we, that is not just the special education department. That is not just the central office. That is not just the principal's office. That is everybody in that school who comes into contact with that child is mandated to follow that process, from physical education teacher on up to the principal to the 504 coordinator, everybody in between, regular education as well. We have to follow it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is the law. Arguing about it would be like stopping on the interstate and yelling at speed limit signs. You can do it, but it's a waste of time. All right, so what is a behavior intervention plan? A BIP, as we call it. So they're designed to prevent behavior that is disruptive in the classroom to ensure students have a chance to reach their academic goals. Again, though, the behavior intervention plan is going to be tailored to that specific student. So there's going to be things in it that could differ. You're going to have, I know this is crazy, and I'm the first to agree. It's hard to follow this, and from a practical sense, it's very difficult. I'm not trying to be belittling or in any way sarcastic. It's a fact. But it's also a fact that you could have multiple behavior intervention plans in the same class, and we got to follow each of those and know each of those. Are they required? Yes, they are required under the law. If you look at 34 CFR 300.324, that is a federal regulation. What does it say? It says a BIP is used when a child's behavior is disruptive and results or stems from the child's disability. The child's IEP team must, doesn't say we can, doesn't say we may, we must consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies that are tailored to that specific child. In addition, as appropriate, a child who is removed from the current placement should be assessed for behavioral intervention, functional behavior assessment. So it's a whole process. I mean, by the time we put that behavior intervention plan in place, and let's say you're a regular education teacher, let's say you're teaching ELA, say you're teaching math, whatever that might be that you're teaching, and we're glad you do it. By the time that behavior intervention plan lands on your desk and we're telling you have to follow it, the IEP team has met probably multiple times, and they've talked about whether or not to do a behavioral assessment. We've done a full behavioral workup from a professional who's trained to do that and qualified to do it. Then the IEP team has probably met again, talked about that functional behavior assessment, talked about how to implement it and what the behavior intervention plan itself will look like, and then it's gotten to your desk. So what we can't do later is one person at the end of that chain who's receiving it can't negate and wipe out all the work we've done to get to that point, because we're mandated to do it under the law, and because the law says it's what's best for the kids. Again, I can't argue with the law. All right, the importance of implementing them. What are the consequences? Remember this, that IEP that we've all gotten so used to following, that's going to talk about what are our accommodations in the classroom. For example, we might have reading accommodations, or we might have homework accommodations, or we might have extended time. Maybe they have extended time during testing. Maybe they get pullouts for reading and they go down to the resource room. Maybe they have OT and PT therapy during school or after school. Maybe they're getting speech language, right? We're all used to those interventions and those services and those accommodations because they're part of an IEP, which again is a federally mandated contract. But I got to say this over and over, the BIP is part of the IEP. It is part of the same contract that we have to follow. So those behavior interventions are just as important under the law and just as mandatory as the academic interventions and services that we've all gotten so used to for many, many years. All right, so look at the Andrew F. case. I'm just going to give you some examples of cases. Here's a case that was bigger. It also had some academic components, but one of the things that was alleged in the Andrew F. case all the way back to the district level was that the school system did in Colorado, failed to implement a BIP for a student who displayed maladaptive and disruptive behaviors. Because of that, and because of failing to implement the IEP and other aspects, the court awarded that student and their parents full tuition reimbursement and transportation costs to a very expensive private school. So if you're talking about, if we mess this up, we're talking about sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, not only hundreds of thousands of dollars, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars over years. Because if we mess it up and we show a court that we're not willing to follow the law and that we're not willing to implement a BIP over a number of years, and let's say that child is 9 and they award tuition reimbursement, that's not tuition reimbursement for a year. That is tuition reimbursement, let's say from 4th grade until they graduate. And some of these schools they're going to, especially if it's a child with autism or severe disabilities, some of those schools cost a lot of money and might even be schools that are out of state and require transport. So that absolutely happens, and it happens the most in cases where faculty members, from principal to teacher to coordinator, whoever, when they show disinterest or unwillingness to follow these plans, because that's when we really get in trouble, and that's when the damages can skyrocket. If we get the Gunnersville case, same type of deal. It's a 17-year-old student in Alabama. They inconsistently implemented the BIP, so the lapse ultimately led to the student's arrest for threatening to assault his teacher. Now, right now, all of you are thinking that there's got to be more to it than that. How in the world can they argue that failing to implement a BIP led to an arrest? I don't know. I don't know all the facts. Here's what I do know: they won. So when the parents sued for that, a jury and or a judge, probably both, agreed, hey, the school system dropped the ball here. If they would have followed the positive reward system and followed the behavior intervention plan, the judge and the jury believed this wouldn't have happened. And because of that, again, they failed to provide it. They got considerable damages and they got the attorney's fees. So when you look at those, again, another thing we have to look at in terms of exposure is that the school system is going to have to be an attorney like me to defend it. And at the end, we might have to pay the parents' attorney's fees. That's how sizable these verdicts can be. All right, and the last one I'll show you, just as an example, is the Spring Branch case. So this is a 5th grade student who was gifted academically. So when you're looking at the IEP, I'll guarantee it in this case, the IEP had almost probably 0 accommodations when it comes to academics, when it comes to pullouts, the typical stuff we might see for reading, for math, etc. And I'll bet you pretty much most of this IEP really dealt with the behavior intervention plan because he had oppositional defiant disorder. And instead of implementing positive behavioral interventions, this district was found to have used physical restraint a lot, told the police to deal with it, and the court upheld a decision that these parents, like the first case I showed you, were provided full reimbursement for private placement. And again, this is a 5th grade student. You're talking about a 10 or 11-year-old. So when normally in these cases, when they're awarded private placement, more than likely what we're talking about here is a kid now getting private placement reimbursement, not just for 5th grade, but for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's sizable and it's a big deal. So to end, the reason that this gets harped on is because it's mandatory. The reason it gets harped on, and the reason I'm probably sounding like a preacher here, the worst preacher in the world, is because I don't want the school system to waste money on me defending these cases. I don't want the school system to have to pay private placement because we ignored an IEP or ignored a behavior intervention plan. And I got to say this, and I got to cut this myth as the last part. That IEP, that behavior intervention plan, those are not just documents that apply to special education. If there are parts of that which are supposed to be implemented, any behavior intervention plan is going to have to be implemented by the whole school. Principal, assistant principal, regular education, special education, everybody, special areas. If they are not implemented, we are all in trouble. Any break in that chain is liability for the school system. So if special education completely implements it, following it to the T, but one regular education teacher just refused to do it, we have liability. If 2 regular education teachers refuse to do it, we have liability. If the whole regular education team does it, but the special education teachers don't do it, we have liability. It is not just optional. It is not piecemeal. It is everybody has to follow these plans. So again, I told you I was going to be short. I didn't warn you that I was going to be preachy, but I think I have to be on this because it is something that I think we struggle with. And I'm not talking about any specific school system. It is everybody. It's something, if I was a classroom teacher, I would struggle with it. I'm one of those people that's old school when I taught, and I want everybody to follow the same rules. I get that. But the reality is we can't do it. If we have a BIP, we have to modify our school rules, our classroom rules, sometimes our school district policies to account for what we've agreed to do in that federally mandated contract. Again, if you have questions, please let me know. Hopefully this has been informative. I know it sounded like a scared straight video, and that was sort of the point, but it's a big deal. We don't want this liability. And more importantly, we want to take care of kids. If an entire team, the IEP team, the behavioral specialist, and everybody has decided before it comes to you that this kid needs specific behavioral supports that are different than the norm, not one person can override that. And we as a school system have decided it, and we as a school system, top to bottom, must follow it. Thank you guys very much. Have a great one, and hope everybody has a wonderful school year.